Hey everyone, this is LuckyLoremaster, and here we are with another Company of Heroes 2 replay. Alright, this time we're going to be going with the US forces in a 3v3 match, and I went with Armored Warfare in City 17. A very fun game. Let's get into it. Yeah, in this game it was just one I brought up. We had some very talented enemy players. Some decent players on our team, but again, the larger the games become, the less, I guess you could say, the more fudge factor you have as an individual player. Obviously, if it's a one-on-one, you know, what you can do is pretty much the extent of your skill. While in a 2v2, you're still pretty sorely needed in order to be able to contribute, but once you get into 3 or 4 team player matches, you can afford to have a weak player or two, and I think both teams had one. But again, that's not really important, who was a strong player, who was a weak player. In the end of the day, it's all about who's the best team. Because, I mean, no matter how efficient you are with resources or how good at micromanagement you are, one player can't beat 3. You know, one player can't beat 4. One player, good player, maybe might be able to beat 2 bad players, but they really have to be doing something wrong in order for that to happen, because there's just only so much your units can do in the face of sheer numbers. Either way, it's a pretty interesting match. I was hoping to get into one of the new boards, because there are actually 10 new maps with this latest expansion, but the random map generator, server, whatever, what have you, put us out on City 17, which is a fun map. It's one of the Russian ones. And as you can see, 3 Oberkommandos versus 2 U.S. forces and 1 Russian. I am one of the U.S. forces again. Went for the tank doctrine, armored warfare. Considering they were all going Oberkommando, I knew that this would be a very mobile battle, and that it would be a whole lot of tank warfare. I felt that the paratroopers would really kind of be compromised as a doctrine, which I used in, I believe, the 1v1 that I did earlier. But that was based off of the fact, hold on, let me switch to my perspective. Alright, show fog, no, remove fog of war, and we want to show resources. Okay, good. And we're going up to ×2. Alright, so, anyway, what I wanted to do is, because there's so many buildings, that kind of compromises, in my opinion, the effectiveness of paratroopers. So I started out making a bunch of riflemen, and going towards the armored angle, which gives you a lot of neat vehicles that you can call in instantaneously, and that can be a major convenience for your team. Alright, so we started expanding outward. The enemy began to do the same. As you could see, they actually rushed the center cap. And this was a game that we had to come back from, because the beginning of it did not start particularly well for us. I mean, I was focusing on riflemen, but I was also building up fuel caches. I actually looked up how to pronounce it. It's not cache, it's actually cache. Kind of funny, but I would have thought it'd be the other way, considering it's a French word, but whatever. Anyway, so, yeah, we're coming on down, and these are Stern Pioneers. Remember the, whatchamacallits, the Oberkommandos. Their engineers are actually very effective fighting units at close and medium range because of their MP-44 assault rifles. The world's first combat-ready combat service assault rifle. So you have to be very careful with them. But obviously, if you bring enough normal riflemen along, you know, they can't deal with that. You're going to see here they actually tried to fight it out. But between, like, using their numbers and cover, you know, I mean, 4 against 10, it's not going to be enough. Obviously, he tried to bring in Volksgrenadiers from the other angle, but my ally would soon come and help reinforce this point while just kind of a long-range battle employed. He had better cover than my guys, but just between the firepower coming from this angle and from that angle, I mean, these guys can't really compete. The riflemen are very strong as long as you can keep them at a decent distance, and they only get more effective with the more powerful weapons you give them from your barracks. So, right now, it was just an infantry fight over my point. Over in the center, they had pretty well captured that because my ally was focusing on protecting this fuel. Our ally over here was playing defensive, and so they were able to set up and start expanding their base from there. However, we did start a bit of an early push. I was trying to make sure my riflemen didn't get overextended. Meanwhile, my ally tried pushing a bit too hard at first. The enemy was able to set up a machine gun and quickly suppress them, and he realized that it would be a good time to fall back. Right now, I was basically just focusing on my side of the map, which was protecting this fuel point and this victory point, which we were going to need for our options. Now, as you can see, because our ally is having trouble pushing into his victory point, and no one is really paying attention until the central victory point, we're actually losing quite a few points. And this was a part where I was kind of wondering, what do I do here? So this is another benefit of the armored doctrine. You can call in assault engineers. These guys are engineers just like your rear echelon guys. However, they are the only unit in the American forces that could be upgraded with a flamethrower, which is very important because they don't. You really don't get it in the standard package. In the standard doctrine, there's no unit that comes equipped with a flamethrower. I don't know why they set it up that way, but that's the way it is. So, definitely one of the benefits of going with the armored doctrine. You know, they're viable in terms of not only assaulting buildings and other infantry, but they can also repair your tanks. So they're a great unit to bring along. And you can see at this point, I'm just kind of trying to keep my infantry strong. I'm already making an anti-tank gun and the captain, because they both have anti-tank capabilities. Considering we were going up against so many Oberkommandos, I knew right away that it was going to get really difficult later on, especially the longer the game went on. And I was having no doubt that they were actually probably trying to drag this out, because you can see here the enemy was fortifying the center, setting up ambush points here with the machine guns, and obviously 2-centimeter flak 38 emplacements to shoot at infantry that tried to raid the point. And right now I was just trying to ball up my forces, and as you can see, my ally was investing very heavily in combat engineers, the Russian engineers with their flamethrowers. They all have flamethrowers, and this actually led to some decent momentum. He decided to assault from the north, while I brought my guys around from the east, and we were pretty much able, using our coordinated efforts, even though the center is being strongly neglected and they're actually moving forward to take ammunition points, we managed to disrupt their entire forward formation here with their battle group headquarters. I mean, his guys were basically moving forward, probing, getting a feel where the enemy are, but then they came around and then came from the left, while I came from the right. And this was all without us actually saying, oh, you do this, you do that. We just did this automatically, and it actually worked out great. It's one of those few opportunities where you're not even really communicating with your teammates, but you just both instinctively know what to do, and then just really start pressuring the enemy. I bring in the anti-tank guns and the captain, and then we can just... None of their vehicles are just doomed. I mean, they can't stand up to this kind of firepower because they're just light vehicles. I mean, they're just... the car gets destroyed immediately. The SWS supply truck's already getting lit up, heavily damaged. And this one has already been turned into a building, the battle group headquarters. So we have immediately put this particular enemy on the back foot, which is definitely something that we needed to do in order to kind of pressure them out of the center. But we didn't want to overextend and go right headlong into their base, because we really didn't have any armor yet. And as you know, the defenses that are set up typically around a base, whether than flak emplacements or machine guns, will suppress infantry fairly readily and inflict casualties. So it's generally unwise to do an infantry rush on the enemy base until you at least have something that can destroy those that can't get suppressed, some kind of vehicle. So built up another fuel cache, and we were pretty happy where we were. As you can see, I was actually bringing down a ambulance car in order to reinforce and heal all of the units here, kind of using this as a rear sector. And I was also working on getting a major, because I wanted to get the armored vehicles out early. Meanwhile, my ally was being more aggressive. He brought out his guards units, very effective, and he started moving back into enemy territory here. Now, as you can see, our northern ally was having serious trouble trying to push into this sector. This player was playing particularly well, and he actually needed vehicles in order to do with that. He was also one of our enemies was moving Volksgrenadier pretty deep in our territory. My major went along to check it out, but obviously the major, not being a combat unit, just had to basically try to scare them off. I called in artillery on the target in case they were dumb enough to stay, but they weren't, so they left rather quickly. And it was this point that I realized I had to use these riflemen and these rear echelon troops to actually kind of take these points back and flush him out. I didn't actually know at the time that he was coming up this way, but I think we discovered fairly shortly what was going on here. Meanwhile, the Allies kind of running around. He's trying to move his forces up from behind in order to try to ambush this point, but little does he realize that it's actually pretty well secured at this point. Again, these assault engineers, ooh, keep them away from flammable objects, because one well-placed grenade and they're in real trouble. You gotta be very meticulous in how you actually use them as a unit. And really what helps is to get your captain in cover, because your captain squad is pretty well armed. Not only do they have bazookas, but like the captain himself has a Thompson, and 2 of the guys have Garands. So overall, it's a very well-balanced and strong squad, the captain squad. 2 bazookas, 2 Garands, and a Thompson. So you can wipe up most enemy formations pretty quickly at medium range. And we took the point back with those infantry I brought forward and started rebuilding the fuel cache. Again, the center was proving to be a tough nut to crack, and we were already down to 300 points. I was kind of wondering, what are we really going to do here? I mean, obviously we have to do something, because the enemy was really building up their infantry forces in the center, and they were starting to push up on the left, too. And so I was trying to think, okay, well, how are we going to really break the enemy's back here? Because we can't just sit on it and wait, because we're losing points now steadily. So I pretty much balled up all my infantry in one force down here once I had secured everything, and was thinking about, okay, well, how are we going to do this? We obviously need to bring in some armor as soon as we can, and sure enough, I was working on gathering the resources in order to build enough armor to do that. But again, one of the serious constraints, considering I like to keep my squads fully stocked so they get decent veterancy status, is just the fact that manpower is constantly at a shortage. And that's with the general efficiency of the U.S. forces. As you can see, the Fallschirmjäger squad's very dangerous. I actually tried to retreat these rifleman squads, and they just barely got away, despite what was going on. Granted, they have a lot of firepower support from this direction, but you really have to be careful how you deploy them. I don't think the major gets wiped out, along with the lieutenant squad. I was thinking, oh, well, let's do a probing assault, considering my ally was doing the same, but there was just too much fire there. I mean, that pretty much convinced us from the get-go that this was not the right way to do it, even though I had brought in another squad from the right, from the east, in order to try to attack, but they just had so many infantry locked up here that I decided that they were taking so many losses. I just said, get out of there, we're not going to be able to hold this. They just have too much momentum, too much force built up in the center. And it was at this point that things were not looking very good. We were kind of wondering, what are we really going to do here? This seems like a pretty serious situation. The enemy over here really isn't doing very much. He's just kind of being very passive at this point, but the enemies over here in the center and on the left are being fairly strong in defending their victory point. They're setting up a lot of critical defenses, and they're hoping just to time us out. That's really what's going on here. And yeah, these 2-centimeter Flak 38 emplacements are a danger to lighter vehicles, so you do have to be wary about that. I had, at this point, pretty much retreated my entire army back to the base, because I wanted to gather them all up in one force and use the ambulance ability of distribute medical supplies, which doesn't cost anything, it just takes a minute to recharge, to heal everyone up, make sure not only they were at their limits in terms of manpower, but also that their health was at full as well. And I started bringing in my Shermans. Now, one of these Shermans ended up being like the MVP of my team on the match. It ended up doing like 12,000 damage and surviving 13,000 damage, with repairs and everything. It was just ridiculous. So I needed to bring some armor in, and I thought, well, should I actually try to assault his forces again in the center now that I've built back up again? Or the notion came to me, considering I was getting so little pressure from this player, who is just taking his time building up resources, to just attack from that perspective. And I was thinking, if we could crush him, then we could attack the enemies in the center, not only from the north or the east, but also from the south as well. Figuring if we could come in from 3 different directions, while my Russian ally in the center keeps the pressure on them, at a fairly constant level, I was figuring we could inflict enormous casualties, because there had been so little activity on my side of the map. I figured this would actually probably be the best way to go about attacking the enemy. As you can see, my ally is actually using a lot of the Russian sniper squads, which are great in that they're either 2-man or 2-woman teams, and so it's much more difficult to actually lose them which is very good. And as you can see, they can easily snipe out the flak emplacements, and once the crew is gone, you can pretty much take that over. And that's something you have to worry about with the flak emplacements that the Oberkommandos have, is snipers can really manhandle those and steal them right away from you. So he's going to have to recrew that. So he did his probing attack and then eventually decided to fall back. I kept moving my forces forward. I was expecting to run into the enemy, at least, you know, over here, but I'm like, nope. He's focusing on a completely different sector of the map, so I just decided to move my armor forward and start destroying these flak emplacements from the east, and that would allow us to just kind of push in from this direction and start really decimating this force, which was the objective all along. I also started calling in M10 Wolverine tank destroyers. That's the third ability of the armored doctrine. The assault engineers I mentioned earlier are the first. There's a passive that allows any vehicle crews you have to be upgradable for 90 munitions with the Thompson submachine gun, making them very effective in close-range combat. So if their vehicle is about to get disabled or destroyed, you can pop them out, and they have a pretty reasonable chance, ability to defend themselves from infantry because of that. I use it a little bit, not too much, because generally you don't want your experienced vehicle crews to be in a situation where they have to abandon their vehicle. Yeah, so I kept pulling in lots of M10s. I knew we were going to need tank destroyers, considering that with 3 Oberkommandos, somebody is going with heavy tanks. You know, if not everybody, considering they're like the big cell of the Oberkommando. So once these crews had been wiped out, it was just a case of moving all my forces in around with the east flank and just really laying into them. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to use any artillery abilities. You actually can't use the really powerful barrages on base sectors. You can only use them on other sectors that do not have a base. Like, with the exception of, obviously, the home base area. If the Oberkommando plants a vehicle out somewhere, that doesn't make it, oh, artillery doesn't work anymore. That's not true. It's just like the home base sectors. And so, yeah, we just basically started destroying vehicles and just totally caught their army unprepared. As you can see, my ally discovered with some of his assault engineers that he equipped with flamethrowers that I had breached this hole. And so while he was pressuring the center of the map with the help of the U.S. forces who were having trouble in the western sector, they decided to join the central sector, while me and the guy playing the Russian characters, the Russian army, just totally swept in here, and we were just wiping these guys up. We inflicted ridiculous losses, and what infantry losses we suffered, I just had my medical ambulance back here to go back there and be a much easier way to reinforce and heal without having to go all the way back to base, which is unfortunately something my ally didn't seem to recognize. He already sent his guys to retreat. A bit unfortunate, but that's just kind of the way it goes. Unfortunately, the lieutenant squad does not get away, it gets killed in the fighting, but that's just kind of one of the realities of this kind of an engagement. I noticed at this point they really didn't have any strong anti-tank defenses, but we had actually taken enough casualties that I was concerned. I felt that we had weakened the army of the southern force enough that now retaking the center of the map would be much more viable. And sure enough, as you can see, our northern ally is now putting considerably more pressure. His units are active in the area, and we were pretty much through our assault here back on this base, making it possible to really tear into them. And as you can see, my ally comes back with snipers and some nice affordable Su-76M assault guns, and sure enough started laying it down. He also has some Ilyushin fighter bombers flying overhead, strafing guys and dropping bombs and all that other fun stuff. I moved the core of my forces that did not need to retreat in order to save themselves back to the ambulance, and was healing everyone and having the rear echelon troops repair my Sherman. Meanwhile, let me see, what did I do with my M10? Ah, this was the time at which I brought up the M10 tank destroyer. Meanwhile, our ally is finally starting to take the center. He's trying to use his riflemen to hold off the Fallschirmjägers. Unfortunately, he doesn't seem to think that he can win against them, which is kind of silly, considering with the troops, when they're armed with a BAR, they definitely have a chance. So, I don't know. Either way, we were putting up massive pressure on this guy. This player was essentially not completely out of it, but on the way. And sure enough, our guy comes in thinking he's going to flank him. He goes streaking in with his Panther, running around the edge. His Su-76 gets flanked and starts getting spotted, and I'm like, well, crap, guys. This guy just drove a Panther right into our base. We were practically waiting for this. I didn't know the Panther was coming, but hey, if he was going to show up, you know, let's not part ourselves of a free meal. So the Sherman, our anti-tank guns, the M10 Wolverine, we all start just going as fast as we can to hunt this guy down. I'm throwing anti-tank grenades at the Panther. We were trying to catch it. I don't remember if we actually managed to catch it. I don't think. No, I think it got away. That's actually one of the really nice features about the Panther, is that it is very mobile. It's got great frontal armor. Its side and rear armor are very vulnerable, and it's not nearly as tough as the Tiger tanks, so you have to be careful in how you deploy it. But if things do go south, you can definitely retreat it, like this guy did, which was a pretty good play on his part. I mean, he had no reason to know that I was actually over here. He just saw that, the Russian guy was attacking. His force seemed weak. Luckily, I had gone far enough into the fog of war, and he hadn't scouted it out, to know that we were pretty much, our whole army was right there, ready to flank his little victory parade. And sure enough, that's what really weakened his forces. Because they had to split their forces between defending this central victory point and defending their ally, that's what pretty much allowed our team to stretch them thin and really start to steal the momentum of the game. Even though we were down a lot of victory points, and in fact the Germans had not even lost any victory points, nearly 25 points into the match, we were now in a position that one player was effectively out of the map, which was very reassuring, to say the least. And now the other U.S. player, thanks to the distraction, was able to move in and finally capture the center victory point. Now, that doesn't mean that the German team was down and out. Even though they were down a player now, they had built up huge defenses in the north. They had distributed their supply trucks all along this axis, and they were still very capable of really ripping into us, despite being one player down. So I had to be judicious in how our resources would be used. As you could see, the Russian player was bringing in his Su-85 medium tank destroyer. Very good tank destroyer to have. Just in general, it's very good. I personally prefer the tank destroyers of the U.S. forces because of their turret. But, a tank destroyer is a tank destroyer, It's always good to have tank destroyers, especially when you're going up against the Oberkommando. As you can see, he's managed to fix his Panther tank. And sure enough, I think they were actually trying to work on getting even more armor than that. It looks like the guy in the north was actually focusing on infantry for the most part. But considering the momentum was good, I figured we'd just keep pushing. As you can see, this was the other unit I called in, the 105mm bulldozer Sherman. This is nice. This is a Sherman armed with the 105 howitzer that equipped some units of the Shermans, which makes it even more effective at killing infantry and damaging structures. However, it makes it less effective against tanks versus the standard 75mm gun, because you can swap between armor piercing and high explosive here, while this is just high explosive, which against tanks it can still do some damage, but it won't do as much damage, and the penetration characteristics are considerably worse. Now here I was trying to find that Panther. That's what I was really wanting to do, find the Panther and destroy it. However, I was being outranged, and with the anti-tank Panzerschrecks that they had, unfortunately I moved up my M10 Wolverine a bit too precociously, and it was destroyed. That was my mistake. But yeah, this is one thing in which the Panther is great. If you have spotter units for it, it has considerable range. I think probably as much range as one of the tank destroyers on your team, so you really have to be careful in how you engage them. At this point, I was just trying to flush out and kill enemy infantry, especially the ones manning the Raktenwerfer. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that properly. But yeah, a lot of the infantry were getting suppressed. Our attack was definitely taking kind of like the heat of the enemy forces out, but we were also taking considerable losses ourselves, so he actually ended up retreating a lot of his sniper squads. And I also repositioned with my anti-tank guns and ambulance, because someone was being sneaky and had actually deployed, what was it, yes, the Fallschirmjägers, which remember can spawn from any building, and had actually taken this victory point back. If we weren't watching our victory points carefully, we were going to be in real trouble, because it would have meant losing the match while we were gaining momentum and actually starting to destroy them. As you can see, this guy wasn't completely out of the match because his allies had bought him time. He started to rebuild. So I immediately moved my Sherman back into the area and my captain. along with the rest of my forces, and just started building up at that location again. Same thing for the forces I had that had to retreat, the Lieutenant Squad coming back. Lieutenant Squad always coming equipped with BARs, a pair of them I believe, which makes them pretty effective against infantry. They're also the cheapest officer to upgrade. It's something like 50 fuel and 200 manpower. And sure enough, I was having to do patrol duty with the Major and the Sherman just to make sure we hold on to some of these other important points that defend our base, which our enemy has been sneakily taking away while we're not paying attention. Meanwhile, the defense around the center is fairly strong, and our enemy was being pretty proactive here in that they were using a Panzer II Luke's light tank in order to go looking for us, where our forces were, what was going on, trying to get a feel. Now this is an option I'll use later in the game. This is the last ability of the Armored Doctrine, 240mm howitzer barrage. Pretty much the largest artillery cannons I think the U.S. ever made, 240mm guns. I mean, just think, that's like 24 centimeters. This thing was probably throwing out shells that might come out of a battleship or something like that. And just so powerful. And yep, they started pushing again for the center. This veteran Panther crew working the team over, but sure enough, they actually had some Wolverines in the area. And this is where they have to be really careful, because the tank destroyers are dedicated tank counters. If he didn't have these Volksgrenadiers armed with Panzerschrecks, he would have been in real trouble. So what we did is artillery. He called in the Aleutians with their bomblets, and I was calling in 240mm artillery at the same time. And we were just devastating this Panther, along with me bringing up my veteran Sherman to help finish him off. Yeah, my teammate was like, wow. Between the Aleutians bombing the center and my 240mm artillery shells and the Sherman running in, yeah, that Panther didn't stand a chance. We were not giving up the center anytime soon. Sure enough, I was bringing up the rest of the army from the west just to kind of get some momentum, get a perspective as to where to go from here. I was just kind of keeping the Major in the rear sector for the time being. And yeah, the enemy team was kind of dismayed because the one guy actually here, the player that we crushed in the beginning of the match, actually quit. So that's why all of his forces are just basically standing around at his base idling. So even though he could have rebuilt that player and recovered his forces and actually tried to contribute to the match, he unfortunately quit on his team, and now the AI is just kind of idling, which is unfortunate, but that is part of what happens. Is if players isn't enjoying themselves, they leave the match. Oh well, we crushed the guy fair and square. I mean, we pretty much moved down on the flank and delivered a severe blow. As you can see, I was making M36 Jackson tank destroyers. They're even more effective than the M10. However, they are produced from your facility, so they are more expensive and they take longer to produce than the M10, but they do have a more powerful 90mm gun versus the M10's 76mm gun. So it's a good thing to know. Right now we're basically balling all up our forces in the center. My ally was making his own vehicles. As you can see, they were trying their best to defend the top, the northern part of the map. My Russian ally, was actually redeploying his forces over here because they were starting to pressure us from that angle, and I think they were pretty keen on not having the same thing happen to us that had happened to the other team. As you can see, one of the features of the bulldozer Sherman with the 105 I mentioned earlier, you can construct barriers. It's basically they just use the bulldozer to plow up a bunch of earth, and it not only serves as a good cover for units, but it also blocks the passage of units. So if you put one of these like in a narrow alleyway between two buildings, vehicles won't be able to drive through it. So you can use it to really kind of clog up armor and funnel them into specific spaces. Granted, the rubble has a hit point amount, so you can basically just, barrage it down or blow it up. But again, that's a delay then, and it doesn't take very long for the bulldozer to actually make that space to do that. And it looks like there was a little fun in the rear action here. He was using Fallschirmjäger just to annoy us again, so I was actually trying to hunt down their Fallschirmjäger squad with my Major and some assault engineers with a flamethrower. And so it was kind of like a Benny Hill style situation here. Here, I'll speed it up real quick just to to kind of accentuate it. Oh wait, well it actually went a lot slower because forces started getting pinned and slowing down, and I was calling in artillery, which he didn't want any part of. Really trying to stay in the cap despite the artillery barrage. I find that pretty surprising. Either way, we just kind of resurged and kept pushing back. I knew that we would eventually push them out. I just was using the major just to kind of distract, because the real threat here against his squad is the assault engineers, and it was all about getting that flamethrower on target. I don't know if the major actually... Yeah, the major squad had ended up dying. I'm pretty hard on my majors, my senior officers, but I just had to make sure that this guy wasn't able to do what he wanted to do in decapping that victory point. Oh man, we didn't get him? I should have swore we set him on fire. Well, it looks like we lost that little fight. Unfortunate, but again, Full-Stream Jaeger is very effective. As you can see, he started trying to push into the center again with some Raktenenwerfers and another Panther, but we had built up so much armor here that we were able to just shove right through them. And even though they had Raktenwerfer squads, you know, just with the high explosive shells all of our Shermans and M10s were shooting, the infantry could not stay manned on that. And something you have to take in mind is that even though AT guns are effective counters against tanks, their crews are exposed no matter what. I mean, they're really best served when you have a spotter that can actually sight for them. But if they have to do their own sighting, they're already in danger of being attacked by your tanks. Now, I actually didn't lose any tanks in this attack. However, I did... oof. That was the Germans using lined artillery. Luckily, we had moved all of our crews in time, so that didn't actually do any damage, thankfully. But it was at this point that most of my vehicles are pretty badly damaged, and so I needed to use my rear echelon troopers to actually start repairing them. And it was this then that we noticed that my ally was the first to notice it, but I noticed it afterwards, that he was being a little prankster with his Fallschirmjägers here. The one guy that survived, taking not only this victory point, but also the fuel cache. And obviously we cannot leave that unanswered for, so we immediately started to reposition our forces over in that direction. With correction, forces that were in a position to do so. Like I sent the healthy M10 Wolverine that I had, while I sent not only my rear echelon guys to repair these guys, I also started making more of them. More rear echelon troopers to repair the tanks, and reinforcing the lieutenant squad. And sure enough, with my ally moving his squad of engineers, he really seems to like using engineers with flamethrowers. I don't know, I guess it's just a fun build. It makes sense too, because the Russians aren't, depending on their doctrine, they're not nearly as dependent on munitions as the Germans are for upgrades. So I guess it's a decent way to get quite a bit of firepower to an otherwise relatively cheap infantry unit. And the enemy started moving in from the south here. I believe it was at this point that the AI took over from that player that we beat earlier, started trying to pressure us, and was moving in trying to take territory points. And it didn't take much for me to wheel in a Sherman, shove one HE shell out there, and because they were so bunched up, I think they ended up killing like 5 or 6 troops. That's one of the real dangers you have to be aware of when you're using troop formations, is if you're able to call in artillery or anything with a decent high explosive gun, they're in real danger. Now, my Russian ally at the same time was actually using his big sniper squad, which pretty much just keeps stealthing around everywhere, to just completely murder any infantry defenses that they had set up. And sure enough, he made a massive Katyusha force, and when he found out where the enemy base was, there goes all the rocket barraging. So he just started picking away at their base already. This guy, of course, was rushing his Panther over and is like, oh, no, I think I'm going to wait before I do anything there. I think the barrage might actually completely destroy. Yep, the barrage completely eliminated his command truck from 3 Katyushas. It's fun to watch. So once I'd moved the tanks over and actually emptied the crew out of one of my M10s in order to take the point, I was pretty happy with where things were going. I was taking a passive role at this point because we had pretty much captured all of the victory points at this point, and were really starting to weather the Germans down. And I wanted to get my tanks all the way up to snuff, because obviously they're much more effective. You need veteran crews really to be able to take the Germans on with an advantage, considering their inherent technological advantage with tanks. Alright, so yeah, he started moving in with Volks Grenadiers and Panther tanks, which snipers really they can't do. They could deal with the Volks Grenadiers, but they can't do much about a Panther. And does this poor damaged Su-85 get away? It does. It does, with a broken gun. Man, that's a rough critical to have right there. Meanwhile, I was moving my forces down south again because I noticed the movement from when they attacked this earlier, so I was thinking, you know, I think they might have rebuilt. If not him, then the AI. And I didn't want them to be on our flank again. This, again, was our Veteran 3 Sherman, which, with its Veteran 3 crew, that I desperately wanted to protect. As you can see, its machine guns just ripping the infantry down at a ridiculous rate. And with the tanks now in tow, even if they did have the Chevert Panzer up, the 37mm gun was going to do very little damage against the front of a Sherman. I mean, it was designed in the era in which these cannons were no longer effective as anti-tank guns. So you're just tearing their base, the AI's base apart. And that wasn't even the full of the force. I mean, a lot of my tanks I was also keeping in reserve. I had one over here with the 105, and I was just keeping the captains and the other senior officers over this way with the ambulance, just to try to get a feel for where they were going to go next. Now, it was at this point that I didn't notice at the time my ally was trying to deal with the Panther moving about in our rear lines. So, because at the time I was so focused on destroying the enemy base, I didn't know what was going on over there. I mean, you'd obviously try to pay attention to the mini-map, but every now and then you're just going to lose attention. Now, this big boy, this is the one we were waiting to see. I knew they were going to make frickin' Tiger 2s, because, hey, it's the Oberkommando. If they can get to the Tiger 2, they're going to make the Tiger 2. So it was just a question of when and how it was going to show up. And sure enough, it did. And he drove it right into the center of the map. And as you can tell, it was going to do a lot of damage. Meanwhile, we had finished pretty much wrapping up that base. He had brought, my ally had brought his trio of Katyushas over, and was going to use them to bombard right into his base here from the south, technique which I particularly liked. He was now just keeping his forces in reserve, trying to get an estimate for how strong our forces were. And I think it was at this point that he realized his base was being attacked, that we were just calling in a huge bombardment, weakening his base structures, inflicting damage on the infantry. And he probably at the time felt, well, should I go back and try to deal with that, or just push forward? I believe at the time he just decided to push. Decided to throw all of these infantry and this King Tiger forward. And while I do have defenses here, the defenses are not enough. I mean, one anti-tank gun, one 105 armed Sherman. I mean, that hit him square in the side. That barely did any damage, because it does not have the penetration characteristics needed to really decimate this thing. Now, meanwhile, my officers and other infantry are in good cover over here, so they were going to be able to inflict some damage. I don't remember if I called in the 240mm barrage again. I knew I had the resources for it. No, I think I actually waited because my officers, despite their valiant defense, there was just too much enemy infantry and they weren't able to inflict many casualties. However, my 105 Sherman, even though it was struggling with the Tiger and had no real chance, I knew that it was at this point that we could at least inflict very bad losses on the infantry, even though we had lost the point. I figured the 105 was toast whenever the King Tiger showed up. So as you can see, these huge explosions being from the 240mm artillery, which is more for area bombardment than picking off specific units or formations. And I was just trying to see, that was a near hit with it, which did a lot of damage to the Tiger II. And I was just trying to hassle it with as much as I could with the anti-tank gun before he managed to decrew it with its machine guns. Meanwhile, down here, our forces were putting pressure on this guy's base while he was taking over the center of the map. We were just shooting this up with everything that we had, doing as much damage as possible, kind of crippling his area, his base, while we were working on this. And sure enough, that was when I managed to bring up my N10, which, remember, is an instant call-in, fantastic resource for the armored doctrine. And I just started to chase this King Tiger. Like, I wanted to get rid of it very badly. And but sure enough, he had managed to retreat pretty well into his enemy territory and wasn't able to continue. Now, we were still losing points because, sure enough, he was doing that old trick with the Fallschirmjägers of taking unguarded victory points when we weren't looking. So we were going to have to deal with that again while we waited for it. So I decided that I had to keep at least one infantry squad and one tank in the center of the map in order to defend it, and I dispatched another Sherman just to get rid of these annoying Fallschirmjägers. I also started to call in more riflemen, and I pretty much instructed that squad to just sit on that victory point so this Fallschirmjäger nonsense would stop. Because they really are useful for that kind of little annoying tactics like that. And as you can see, we only have about 50 victory points left. We had to be very cautious about how we deployed our resources, because we could still lose the game, if not by the sheer force that the Germans were able to exert, but just by them holding the victory points on a technicality. As you can see, my ally had enough too, and actually brought in all these infantry, all these snipers, just to make sure that does not happen again. Meanwhile, I was repairing up my tank force over here with my rear echelon troops, while also having my guys here in the center. Sure enough, the Katyusha started up with another barrage, and just devastating, calling in on the infantry formation back at their base. Some of them getting wiped out. I mean, it's just absolute chaos. One of the things I really like about getting a guy who will invest in making 2 or 3 Katyushas, because they can just completely wreck enemy defenses once you've located where they actually are. And at this point I pretty much did, hey Sherman, hey Rifleman, we've got the enemies on the defensive. You know, they can try to strafe us all they want, but we're not going anywhere. Oh, sure enough, he was calling in the Fallschirmjägers again, but now that we were waiting for them this time, they were gunned down in a real hurry. Neat thing about the 50 cal on the Sherman is that it will shoot at aircraft. It's not as effective, obviously, as a 20mm or a 37mm anti-aircraft gun, but you can still occasionally get a plane or two if you have enough of them in an area and they aren't otherwise preoccupied with something else. As you can see, his forces here in the center at the base had just been completely wiped out, and it was at this point that they were really on the back foot in terms of the confrontation, and he needed to bring in his heavy units to get rid of my Shermans. And sure enough, that is when the King Tiger arrives. As you can see, one hit, and my Sherman is nearly dead. Just to give you an idea how powerful it is. However, he's a smart player. He was focusing on my Jackson with its 90mm gun, which was much more effective at damaging us. And sure enough, I had already lost 2 units. Boom, boom, they're both down, and he was bringing in a Jagdpanzer IV, which is a very effective tank destroyer, very accurate, and has very long range. It was this point that I knew the jig was up, and so did my very veteran Sherman crew, so I decided to pull back the forces immediately. And my ally here was zooming up here with his Su-85. I wasn't really sure what he was doing. I think he was actually trying to catch them on an ambush, but he ended up just taking a few shots for no real reason. And they didn't want to chase us into the city, because I think they kind of knew at this point, at least intuitively, that we were preparing to kind of try to drag them into a counterattack. Now, it was at this point that we were trying to really cripple their tank force, because they still had a pretty effective one. He had pulled the King Tiger back and it was starting to have it repaired. But I figured, and so did my ally, that this was an excellent opportunity to try to catch the Jagdpanzer IV off guard. And so he was actually calling in aircraft to strafe it, and was using quite a few M10 Wolverines, the US ally, in order to try to charge it down. And I think just shortly thereafter is when I decided to actually come into the fight. As you can see, the AI was slowly starting to rebuild their base, but it's pretty much just de facto out of the game at this point, not really kind of making any meaningful resurgence. He very wisely retreated this player, his Jagdpanzer, back, and sure enough brought up the King Tiger. Now the question was, at this point, is like, are we going to really commit and try to destroy this thing? And we're like, why not? They don't have really, they have infantry, but they don't have infantry that have any meaningful anti-tank capability. The Sturm Pioneers do not. So I was desperately trying to drive this M10 Wolverine back around behind him in order to get the rear shots and finish him off. Now, his King Tiger was badly damaged, and I was just like, we need to finish that tank off. So I started calling in tanks from nearby sectors, and I'm surprised he was actually holding this Su-85 back, because I knew the priority at this point was get rid of that goddamn Tiger tank, because you know, that King Tiger, they were just going to keep repairing it, and they were just going to keep giving us more problems. I pretty much took my other M10 that I held in reserve here and my Sherman and just rushed him and tried to get around behind him as quickly as possible, because I didn't want that tank to be back in action again. I mean, it's very powerful, but once you force the Germans to actually lose one of these monstrous tanks, it's a huge impact on their resources and their basically their war effort. I mean, it just really damages, because it's like 26 pop cap. It's basically losing a King Tiger tank is like losing a quarter of your army. And even though these poor crews of the M10 and the Sherman eventually get sacrificed, it was worth it, because with a combination of him calling in the Aleutian Strike and me using these tank destroyers, we finally managed to cook up that Tiger II and leave it a burning wreck. And so now there was pretty much nothing to be had from that. We had just completely devastated the thing. As you can see, it looks like it's repairing. What they were really doing was just scavenging for resources in the wreckage, trying to take advantage of what was left of it. Now, unlike the enemy, we actually had plenty of resources aside from manpower, so we could reinforce our forces very quickly. This was kind of an awkward point at the map, because we had thrown a lot of our forces in trying to bring down their King Tiger. And even though we still held 2 of the 3 victory points, and they didn't really have much of a defensive force on the northern victory point, we had invested a lot of our resources, at least I had, in bringing it down. And so my allies started calling in their tank destroyers, their M10s, along with what other resources they had. Meanwhile, I was kind of pulling up in the center at this point, because I did have a few tanks and some infantry squads left. And I was just thinking, what do I really need? How should I organize? How should we finally launch the final attack on the enemy? Because I was kind of thinking that maybe we could actually finish this map before the actual victory ticker. But I wasn't really certain. Now, this is what you should definitely do with the M10, or any other tank destroyer of the American variety, is use that turret's capability to rotate to get behind your forces, because even though the Jagdpanzer has a decent turn rate, I mean, it's just completely vulnerable from the sides and rear. It has no capacity to defend itself if you manage to flank it. So that's something you really have to keep in mind, and is why the Germans always are trying to do this kind of standoff approach to it. Meanwhile, our allies are kind of poking and prodding, inflicting losses on their tanks and other vehicles. As you can see, the Fallschirmjägers are using their Panzerfaust to damage the engine of this Su-85, but it's just a one-use ability, so they don't really have the capacity to actually destroy it properly. And I was balling up all my forces here, again bringing in another Jackson, because I figured if they managed to produce one King Tiger, it wouldn't be surprising if they managed to put up another one. If not immediately, but reasonably soon. I mean, the game had been going on, as you can see, for nearly 54 minutes now. But they were really starting to lose their momentum here. We were moving, the U.S. forces for my ally were moving their infantry in on the north and finally capturing the 3rd victory point. The AI down here was just pretty much inactive. They were slowly building up a force, but they didn't really have very much to commit with it. Because the AI, when it gets defeated, it tends to act weird, and then it just tends to build, and then throw out all of its forces at once. Which is, interesting, but not particularly helpful for the German team right now, because it's still technically anybody's game. If they're able to recover from that losing that King Tiger and concentrate their forces, they could make a comeback, but right now they're just desperately trying to kind of rebuild from all of the damage that we did, and this is what really allowed us to come back in this game, as you've probably seen earlier in the video, is just to come and sweep out, take out another player that, even though they're technically not out of the match, once an AI replaces a player, unless it's like an expert player, it's just not as good. Sure enough, they had made another King Tiger, and we didn't know where it was at the time. It was actually nowhere near our forces, which we found a touch odd. And I also noticed from the infantry that he was making that he didn't have any anti-tank infantry that he made, which I found really surprising, because, what did he expect us to bring to the party? I mean, the Sturm Pioneers are very effective against other infantry, as is the MG-34 heavy machine gun. But from what I remember, they actually don't have any decent anti-tank capabilities, neither unit, which I found a little bizarre. Now, sure enough, he was using smart tactics again here with his Jagdpanzer IV, shooting up at my Jackson from long range. The Jackson, I think, was returning fire at him, but because he had gotten the first shots and was more accurate, he actually managed to destroy the Jackson I had brought up. which I found very irritating, so I immediately sent forward my M10. I wanted to freaking take that away from him. But as you can see, if you micro your Jagdpanzer IV particularly well, he managed to rotate this back and keep the M10 in front of it, and managed to shoot fast enough to actually destroy both of my tank destroyers, which was very well played on his part. However, where there's one, there's more, and if there's one thing that's really great about the versatility of the U.S. forces, it's just by the fact that you can replace their losses so much easier than the Germans can. Now, I decided to bug out because I didn't know how much more armor he actually had in the field here. I didn't want to lose yet another tank destroyer to an ambush like that because his infantry had spotted us. And this was a surprise. This was when the AI actually decided to take all of that infantry it had spent so much time pulling up and just to deploy in the area. Now, just kind of out of spite, I started shooting the 240mm howitzer barrage in the sector just because I didn't want him to get anywhere near that victory point. So I figured he was about to decap it. But sure enough, the enemy was now down to only 25 victory points. And it was now just a case of, well, are we going to launch an attack now, or are we going to wait for them? I was busy rebuilding my forces, concentrating them not only in the center to make sure the victory points are okay, but also in the other sector here. As you can see, these huge explosions completely destroying the buildings, and that barrage is what kept them from decapping us long enough that we were able to win the match. And sure enough, that proved the critical point. We were able to secure the victory, put the Germans completely off their heel and come back from what was otherwise looking like an obvious loss to a strong counter-thrust. And I definitely feel we could have dealt with these infantry because they were balled up. They could all easily be killed by a few well-placed Shermans. And meanwhile, this this King Tiger might have been a problem, but we had been building tank destroyers, so we could have dealt with that. Again, their base, they were just desperately trying to rebuild, but our ally in the north, the Russians, were just pushing through, along with American armor assistance. They were going to crush the northern base very shortly, and the map was pretty much up. We turned what could have been a defeat into a victory. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this 3v3 match featuring U.S. Armored Commander Doctrine. Next video will be a 4v4. Which I'll give you a bit more information about next time, once I put it up. Okay, thanks for watching, everyone. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Take care. See you later. Bye-bye.